am I considering deviation on Bollinger Bands or linear regression? Caution in longing when overextended bullish, caution if shorting when overextended bearish. Right, so that's kind of a good example. We talked about near over here. This was one that we had on another video, and you want to be careful. If this channel was a lot smaller, it may or may not make sense, right? If the channel ended here and this was the bottom, we kind of get to a point where you need really, really tight asymmetry for it to make sense. And then if the numbers organically don't make sense, then you really have to consider using leverage. So tight asymmetry with a high risk reward ratio, realistic, and then decide on what magnification is right for you. In this case, most people would say this is fine organically, right? If I made 30% buying near, and I actually owned near, and then I bought it and I made 30% on my US dollar ratio, I'd be happy, right? If you did it with 2x or 3x, obviously even better, because your ROI, if you were successful, would be 60 or 90. So those are good things. So going back to storage, am I overextended? No. Overextended would be this over here. And it's a great example of a place that it didn't work, right? So if that channel was exactly the same back then, and you decided you wanted to enter here, you'd have to be really, really cautious and understand that you might be entering at a statistically overextended place. Why? Because if you entered a trade there, you're very overextended from the movement monitor. A retrace back to the movement monitor is, I wouldn't say imminent, but very highly probable, right? Especially in the 2-hour time frame. They all have different ways of looking at them, but it's definitely highly probable. And then a retrace, I would say, based on the channel itself, becomes highly probable, because now you're at the very top end of the channel, which is a place where you almost want to be considering a short, right? If you saw a channel that was working and it was being respected and there were no signs of it not being respected, then the whole goal would be to trade the channel as you see it, because you know it's performing. You see the historical evidence that it's performing, right? So if we look at this channel and we say, like, okay, give or take, what does it look like? Here it is, right? And let's just take it for what it is now. We see it go from here to the top end of the channel here, and then over time back to the bottom end of the channel. And so we could kind of look at it and assume there's a good probability that as long as it stays working and we don't see channel breaks begin to form, which could easily happen as well, that the next part of the channel would be, maybe somewhere up here at a certain point in time. And then we could literally take a look and say, okay, give or take, just drawing random things, be around Valentine's Day that I'd be taking profits, right? And that would just be a random assumption. It could happen anywhere in here. But if it continues the same trajectory, it would be there. It's possible that it drops and it continues to go to a further downside part of the channel, which is probably going to happen if Bitcoin specifically has challenges. But then you can literally kind of look and see how correlated they are, that sort of thing. But what I will say is the reason that that's not something I'm looking for now is because we have the orange on orange configuration. And even in the 4-hour, we have an orange configuration. When this gets breached, it would be even more bullish, but I would not want to take my long here. I would way rather take my long when it's not overextended from the movement monitor, and then I would go for it, because then I'm in a position of profit by the time price action gets here, and I could insert a trailing stop, or I could move my stop loss up a little bit and ensure profit. If I enter my long here, unfortunately, I don't have much room to do anything if I get rejected at that yellow line, right? So I'm looking for a less overextended situation. And this, like I said, is just a great example of being overextended on the channel itself, right? When I'm longing from this very top part, I have to be careful, right? Maybe it's been in an uptrend for a while, as was the case over here, right? It had just gone straight up for quite a while, so it was a lot of up pressure. And then eventually it was at the top of the channel, which was a dangerous place to short because it was overextended. If it's overextended from, the movement monitor on the 1 day or the 12-hour, other larger time frames, the 4-hour, then even more of a reason to be cautious in longing at the top end of a larger channel. And again, this is, I think, a 16-day channel. So something to consider. Be cautious of that. If you were going to do it, I guess you could use this pressure line and then utilize asymmetry to make sure that if you lost, you mitigate your risk to something small like this 0.85%, right? You could do that, and because you're actually doing something that could statistically go against you, maybe you only 2x leverage that instead of what maybe you would normally think you could do, like 5x. And so the minimal leverage is because you know that you're longing a dangerous place, right? You're longing in a dangerous place. And so you could literally mitigate risk by decreasing your capital in that trade, and you could mitigate your risk by decreasing your leverage beyond what you would normally do in that trade. Make it lower than what's normal for you, right? Those are two different ways of decreasing your trade. You're decreasing the magnification, you're decreasing your organic capital at risk, and those are great ways to mitigate risk for someone who knows they're violating 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 rules from the checklist, right? The more rules you're violating, the less organic capital you should risk, and I would say also the less magnification you should use. The more rules that you've double checked that you feel great about, maybe the more you should consider increasing your absolute value of your position, or maybe using a slightly higher yet still responsible leverage, right? So this would be the opposite end, right? Provided this channel, and it might not have been, but supposing this channel was somewhere toward the bottom here, and then at some point you saw orange on orange form on meaningful time frames, and then you identified that we were in a bullish channel, big picture, right? Past 16 days, hey, they're kind of like turning bullish. Maybe you started to see some channel breaks to the upside. Well, entering on the bottom side of this channel for a long is a nice place to be. Even entering on the bottom, just the bottom side is kind of a sound place to enter statistically. If you have conditions conducive, right? Orange, and so forth and so on. And you kind of know what you're up against, but at least you have some statistics working for you. Okay, so that is deviation. Bollinger Bands, it's the same thing. You throw a Bollinger Band up there, you want to be cautious longing at the far extended top side of a Bollinger Band, right? That's something you should kind of take into account, but it's a similar concept to the channels. And then the same thing on the bottom side. You want to be cautious, expecting continued down pressure if you're shorting at the very extreme bottom ends of Bollinger Bands. And that's when it's most relevant. If you find yourself at the extreme low or high ends of Bollinger Bands, and when you plan on entering your trade, like that's where the price action is, that's where I would definitely be cautious, because that's generally where it could reverse. If you happen to be thinking of doing that right at a pressure line where the pressure line's also going to work against you, you may actually avoid that, or you may actually do the inverse of your idea, right? And there's actually a place down, I think somewhere on the checklist, where it talks about maybe doing the inverse of your idea. Right, so let's talk about that. Bollinger Bands, linear regression, caution and longing when overextended, right? And we talk about overextension from the movement monitors too. In other words, if price action is way above the 4-hour, it may not be the best place to long. We just kind of shared that example on storage, right? Wait until the retrace to a more appropriate entry. Just use some patience and you'll last a lot longer. You'll be more successful in general, versus the persona that is impatient, that can't wait, that does everything instantly, that feels like there's not enough time. There's always enough time. Next, if using significant leverage, mind the scalping timeframes as well. So, I would say the point of that is to evaluate what's happening on the 12-minute, 24-minute, the 45-minute, right? Maybe even the 5-minute before you enter a high leverage trade. The higher the leverage, the more you probably should pay attention to some of that, because otherwise you may be tempted to long or short at a pressure line, and you simply could have waited and watched the 5-minute movement monitor move toward that pressure line, and it will either breach it or it'll bump into it, it'll show respect for it, and it'll start to kind of go back, and it'll get rejected essentially. And there's almost always time for you to use that information to avoid entering a short just before that movement monitor was going to touch the line, never change from orange and just burst through it, right? And if you could have just waited and watched for that, you would have never entered that short, because the 5-minute movement monitor never even turned from orange. At least you have more of a chance if you enter when the 5-minute movement monitor gets close to that line, kind of gets rejected, just pushes up against it, and then maybe even better, starts to invert, starts to go blue. And that's, I think, a much more opportune time for somebody to short. And the 5-minute is very sensitive, right? We all know that. It's that the price action is extremely sensitive, and the movement monitor is also sensitive, but it's just enough perspective for it to be usable. So keep that in mind when you're thinking of doing anything with significant leverage as price action is approaching a pressure line. The 5-minute will often give you a clue as to whether or not what you're doing is smart, and there's always time to wait for it to see how it reacts. Again, especially with high leverage or even significant leverage. Okay, so mind the scalping timeframes. Have I considered that? Yes or no? Much more important when you're using higher leverage. When you're using 2 or 3x leverage, those things are still important. You should probably use them anyway, but they're not going to have as much of an impact as they would with 10x leverage or so, or 5x leverage on a very volatile asset like storage or SafePal or something like that. Have I considered this? Yes or no? Very simple.